Hello, welcome back to eMerge, the health podcast for busy, high performing women. I'm your host, Dr. Alex Swinson Ridley. Today, we are diving into something I have been working on and thinking about and ruminating over based on conversations I've had either with new clients or just women in the community, in our free community, and also with my clients. And that is, you know, can we boil down and simplify the process to really transforming our hormones? And I feel like I've done it. So I'm going to talk about the 5 steps that are necessary to do that. But before I even get into that, I just wanted to share and kind of reiterate it's been a little while since I've talked about on the show, like why I do what I do and, how I got into doing this. Is just something I always ask the women that I interview on the show. And so I wanted to, just jump into some of that briefly. And then we're going to talk about, okay, what the heck did we actually do to get our bodies in balance, and is that balance even achievable? This is a question I posed last week. I got crickets to it, but I think it's interesting, so we're going to talk about it. um, that could have been Facebook algorithms. It's all good. So I think everyone knows my story to an extent on the show, but I experienced, I'm 37 at the time I'm recording this in 2022, right? When I was about 33, 34, things hit the fan in many ways in my life. I had gone through a divorce. I was dealing with kind of the fallout of all of that high stress. Not there was trauma involved in that relationship, emotional trauma, and we're going to talk more about that because that's actually one of the steps that I'm going to go over. But lots of emotional abuse, just kind of putting me down all the time. And so I came out of that marriage like a shell of a person. My wrist was torn in 6 places from my career as a chiropractor. I had this huge business, and shortly after divorce, went through the process of buying and remodeling a building, and like had a team with 12 people, and our biggest year, I basically had a 7-figure business. We built out that much and collected close to that, our biggest year in that practice. And I had this moment where I walked upstairs in, this beautifully remodeled office and all of this stuff. I was a single mom at the time, all the things. And I looked around and I was just like, oh, this is not the dream. And like, what have I done? Because I felt so trapped, so stuck, and from that point, a lot of things went wrong. And many of you know my journey of I finally hit the point last year of between the insurance industry, we ran into a problem with Blue Cross Blue Shield, which is one of our like the biggest source of income for our business. They just stopped paying us for 6 months, which is great when you have an overhead and people to pay, right? So we dealt with that. We dealt with the bank being kind of not very nice around the building, even though I found renters and in the middle of COVID and eventually got them to buy the building, all this stuff. It was a sequela of events, and I really didn't want to be doing or in that line of work anymore in that field. And dealing with the identity shift of recognizing that because it had been a decade and, more than a decade since I started school, and really like being a chiropractor became a huge part of my identity, and my health just tanked. I put on weight, I lost my hair, I was losing my voice like every day. I would come home and not really be able to talk. I legitimately lost it for a couple weekends in a row. Always when we had a big event, there's, some things tied to that I've learned now, those ways of me trying to self-sabotage in ways because things had grown to a point where I was uncomfortable. And so I was trying to get myself comfortable again. A lot of us will do that. That's not really the subject of this podcast, but all of that led to me, just recognizing in myself and in so many women that I saw, because I saw a lot of kids and I was a pediatric chiropractor. I saw all these moms and older women too, grandmas, who were just stressed and not making time for themselves and not healthy and had no energy and, didn't know how to make time for themselves and had a dream, but like no motivation of how to get there or any of that stuff. And so my own journey where, I went down the roads of like actually seeing some doctors when I got remarried and health insurance, and all the answers were, "Oh, you're fine. Like, yeah, you just, lose some weight, work out more." And I'm like, that's not the freaking answer. And so I have gotten into doing what I'm doing because I've become so frustrated. I never was part of Western medicine, but I really truly believe and feel that Western medicine is just not designed to help women handle balancing their hormones. And so many of us have normalized so many of the things that are indicators that our hormones are out of whack. If you're still menstruating and not through menopause yet, it's PMS. It's knowing full well when your period's coming because you're mean to everybody, or you're super bloated, or you have horrible cramps, or your breasts hurt terribly. And or your cycles are off, maybe they're inconsistent, or you have facial hair, like all of that stuff is a sign that hormones are off, right? You don't get consistent periods, maybe you have acne, like there's all these different things that are all of those are hormone imbalances. And it tends to be that the Western medical way of dealing that is like, oh, go on birth control or, get an IUD, one of those things, so that your body's just being regulated by artificial hormones. All of that has dangers. We don't really need to go into that right now. Most of you know what they are, but it increases your risk of cancer. Generally, they're using forms of estrogen that are more predominantly known to, they're not the healthy forms of estrogen. So they're the ones that can cause problems down the road. And your body's having to metabolize all that still. So then your liver's messed up and all that jazz. So we have that going on. And then, you know, if you're in menopause or in perimenopause, in the US in particular, we have some of the highest rates of just symptoms and feeling terrible. Like other countries, other women are not dealing with the extent and the severity of, night sweats and weight gain and all of the being tired, the like painful sex, all of that stuff. They're not experiencing that to the level that we are here. And there's reasons for that. And often, in that population, because that's largely who I believe most of our listeners are, and a lot of the women I work with are actually in their 40s and 50s and kind of approaching or in that stage of life. They just put you on hormone replacement therapy without ever actually checking your hormones. Like, they don't look at them. And I'm like, ugh. And so, how can they know? Because a lot of times the women that I work with have been put on, even if it's bioidentical stuff, like they've been put on hormones that are skewing their ratios of, progesterone and estrogen. So they're still experiencing symptoms and or they're having a really hard time losing weight. So, this is my why I find it really frustrating that this is where we're at. And I know it's possible to balance this stuff without needing to go down the roads of Western medicine. Like, does it exist for a reason? I didn't even touch on the thyroid, and that's a whole other conversation. But that's another piece of the pie. Because 1 in 8 women experiences a thyroid problem. If you're through menopause, it's 1 in 3. Like, all of us have problems, but they rarely diagnose it because the ranges are too broad and they don't actually look at all of the data to get there. So, if you're someone who's listening to this show and you're exhausted or your hair's falling out or you can't lose weight or and you're doing all the things or feel like you've tried everything under the sun and either it just keeps going up or it's not coming down, or like you woke up one day like I did and your pants didn't fit and you're like, what in the heck? All of that is signs of hormone imbalance. And so what I want to talk about today, I wanted to share a little bit of my why because I find it frustrating. And there's people talking about this, but it's, we tend to be so surfacey focused. That's what I'm trying to say. Surface focused, symptom focused in the Western world, in the United States in particular. Europe is a little bit different, not entirely. And we do have some listeners over there. So, and I know many of you relate to this because you listen to my show. Um, so, we tend to be focused on symptoms and it's like, oh, well, how do we fix the symptoms? Usually it's take a pill or something. And so, I try really hard to both help women get relief, and so there are supplements that help with some of that stuff. Yes, I'm not going to talk about them today. Sorry. If you really want to know, send me an email and I'll send you some information. But I'm more interested in what's really at the root of why we feel terrible and don't have energy and are overweight and don't have the motivation to do anything about it and want to be able to hike. The women I speak to every day are like, I want to be able to hike and play with my kids and my grandkids and do the things and not have the crash in the afternoon and, feel good and confident in my body. And it's not even necessarily about losing weight. It's just like they want to feel like themselves again. And I know if you're listening to the show, you're probably one of them. So what we're going to talk about today is the 5 steps to actually do that. And I just want to preface this with I'm not going to go into like a super large amount of detail on this because it's taking me 10 minutes to get to the introduction here. But over the next 5 weeks in the free Facebook group, if you're not in there, it's free. I don't necessarily love Facebook, but I show up for that. That's pretty much why I have an account. We've had a little bit of downtime recently, but I'm actually going to take over the next 5 weeks each of these steps and go into a lot more detail in there. So if you're not in the group, there's a link to join it in the show notes. Join us in there. Nobody's selling you anything. It's none of that. And I will be going live every Wednesday. I go live for Wellness Wednesday, and that's going to be our theme. Is we're going to do a deep dive into each of these steps. So with that said, let's talk about it. Step one is we got to transform our energy. Like, you cannot do anything differently to start feeling better until you have some energy. And some of why we don't have energy is related to our hormones being out of whack, yes, and we have to work on all that. But there's also ways that our body stores energy. And so this is some of the newer stuff I've started teaching and working on myself and talking about. But we have pockets of and places where we store energy in the body. I like to call them energy centers. There's 7 of them. And so they follow the spine, but you have one at your root is number 1, your perineum, just kind of below your belly button is the second one, and that all of these are connected to all of our organs too. So the first 3 have a lot to do with digestive stuff, which we're gonna talk about in step 3, or step 2, just kidding. So we have the root, we have number 2 is just below your belly button. The third is kinda your solar plexus area, like the pit of your gut, kinda where you feel like either the butterflies if you're nervous or excited. The fourth is your heart, right behind your sternum. The fifth is at your throat. This has a lot to do with thyroid stuff. The sixth is kind of the back of your skull, like where your throat and the back of your skull meet, that area, lower part of your brain. And then the seventh is kind of in the middle of your head, in the middle of your brain. And in some worlds, there's an eighth center that's just kind of the bigger energy field around us. They've measured all of these. My point with this is if you are someone who tends to be what we call selfless and not focused on yourself. You're dealing with selfless syndrome, as I talk about on the show often, and you're giving and giving and giving and giving all the time. You get out of balance in these centers, and there's not enough energy. And essentially, it's our life force, literally, like we are energy. There's not enough of that coming in. And so we don't have energy. So part of how we start to get energy back is by learning how to tap into these energy fields and reignite them. And we do that with emotions and working through a lot of stuff. I've done a lot of work in this. I'm not going to go into all the details. Like I said, we're going to talk about this in the group starting this week. This comes out on Tuesday. We're in the group tomorrow. If you're listening to this on Tuesday, if you missed it, the recordings will be there. It's all good. So that's step one, and that's only part of the pie. We've also got our mitochondria are what produce energy in our cells and in our body. And so there are ways to start to increase that as well, naturally without having to do things. But it looks like starting to tap in and tune into ourselves in a way where we start to increase our energy naturally and start working on, some of the routines and habits and things that we need to cultivate and maybe, alter and do things a little bit differently to start increasing that energy. But that's the first step because nothing else is going to make any difference until your energy starts to come up. Number 2, that's not entirely true, but it makes a big difference if we feel good, right? And that's generally the first thing that I hear from women that I work with. Number 2 is we have to heal our gut. So much of our hormone stuff is involved in the gut. My child decided now is a good time to interrupt and stomp on the floor, so I apologize. The gut is, our liver metabolizes hormones, particularly estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, all of that happens in the gut. Our thyroid is very much dependent on good gut function because the usable part of our thyroid hormone is produced in the gut and converted in the gut. Our there's so much some like our metabolism, our hunger cues, hunger satiety cues, all of that is hormones that are related to the gut. So we have to have good gut function. I go super deep in this. I've talked about it on the show. We have to look at things like parasites and how toxic we are. If you're constipated or having too frequent of bowel movements, if you're chronically constipated, not going often enough or you kind of swing both ways, there's no way your hormones are imbalanced because they're just not able your body's not able to metabolize them and do the things it needs to do, clear the things it needs to clear and do all that. So, we have to deal with that. That is step 2. I have a really detailed process on how I do this. If you can say like, "Hey, I have 2 normal poops a day, at least 2 to 3," then you are good and your gut is working well. Most people can't say that. So, that's kind of a basic look at that. So that's step 2. The third one is we have to balance our brain. And again, this is something new I've been starting talking about more, but to really truly make change that's sustainable and long lasting, we have to start rewiring the connections in our brain. And we have to let go of the old patterning that has us stuck in the place we are in the first place. I think about in healing our gut in particular, there's 2 pieces to this. One is how we relate to food and our relationship with food, and the other is how we relate to stress and our relationship with stress, because typically they are combined, and many of us are using food as an emotional outsource, and so we have to start to change those relationships. And so that is part of where rewiring our brain comes in. The other parts have to do with energy and getting, our brain detoxed as well in order to have normal function. Also, the brain is where your hypothalamus lives, and your hypothalamus is in control of everything related to your hormones in your body. So that all has to be working right. And so that's the third step, is really getting all of that moving. And a lot of these kind of work together, but we have to address it from all perspectives. Number four is healing emotionally. So many of us, and this is specific to trauma. I said we were going to talk a little bit more about this. I have been somewhat surprised, not really, but somewhat surprised how often, most women that I work with, there's like major trauma, right? Like, alcoholism in the family, or um, domestic abuse, violence, like there's that kind of stuff, sexual assault, all of those things. And most of us tend to relate to trauma as being that, right? And that is certainly a piece of it. However, there's also just day-to-day traumas of being alive, where, if you feel out of control, or like you're not in control, or you're taken advantage of, or there's many different ways that we are traumatized. And so all of these things, we store this stuff in our body. It depletes our energy, it messes with our systems, it does all this stuff. And so we have to be able to work through a process where we're able to really let go, and not, let go in the sense of, like, I haven't talked about forgiveness so much on the show, but so many of us tend to relate to the idea of forgiveness as letting someone off the hook. But really, it's about us. And there's so many studies out there now that show the connection between trauma, between emotions, negative emotions in particular, like low level emotions, which are shame, guilt, grief, all of that stuff, hatred, fear. All those things are kind of those lower level things that are depleting your energy, but also end up causing, they're being found to be the root cause of things like cancer and, heart disease, and a lot of the top killers in our society are actually related to that. So we have to be able to work through that stuff so that we have full balance and, full regulation of our nervous system, of our brain's ability to send messages, and the body to do with those messages what it needs to do with, which is what rebalancing the brain also had to do with in the third step. So, step four is kind of building on that. And then the fifth thing is, I haven't come up with a good name for this yet, because, like I said, I just came up with this process, but, or not really, like, I've always been doing this, but we boiled it down to really be succinct in how we look at it. But essentially, it comes down to your ability and capacity to lead yourself. Because this is something I talk about with the women in my program all the time. We have group calls, and this tends to be where this comes up the most, is we have to be able and willing to lead ourselves and to stand against the grain. Because when you're talking about approaching health in this direction, and not, just taking the pill, or the birth control, or the hormone replacement therapy, or, whatever it is, when you're doing something different and committing to a different lifestyle, and maybe you're eating differently. And again, like, I'm not about, like, here, eat this diet. It's about finding what works for you and in your body, and has you feel good and feel healthy. When you're doing that, it's really easy to be challenged by society, right? And, like, I can't tell you how many times my husband's like, "Why can't you just eat McDonald's?" I'm like, "Oh my god, I haven't had McDonald's since I was like a kid, and I'm not gonna start now." But, you have to be willing to lead yourself and others. And so there's a big part of this healing process that involves really getting in touch with yourself, being challenged, being uncomfortable, and being willing to grow in that process. And that is, ultimately what leads you to sustainability and true commitment, and not being overwhelmed by feeling like you're always on a diet or doing something with food. Is we have to go on a journey of self-discovery, and find that, like, help our body physically heal, but we also need to be willing to grow as a woman in the world, and stand up for, who we really are, and be the light. I always share the quote by Marianne Williamson. We have to shine our light, because by doing so, we give permission to those around us to do the same. And it's not the whole quote is, it's our deepest fear. It's not that we are inadequate. It is that we are powerful beyond measure. It's not our light, but but the dark that, comes in, and we have to be willing to let our light shine. I'm paraphrasing here, but you can Google it if you want to. So those are the five things that, if you really are serious about getting your hormones in balance and doing all those things, and is it helpful to have labs? And, Absolutely. Like, I do all that stuff with my clients, and it's helpful objective data. It doesn't really change how I go about approaching things in terms of the framework. It might individualize some stuff with supplements and, certain things we focus on more than others. But ultimately, if you're really serious about having your body like feel good and have energy and be able to do the things you love to do and all of that stuff, this is the framework that we have to work in. This is what I've been doing. This is what I did with myself. This is what I've been doing with the women that I work with now. And I want to be able to, have more women be able to come into that world and take that journey. So the last thing I wanted to share with this is, get in the free group because I'm going to dive into each of these things in a lot more depth in there over the next 5 weeks. Links in the show notes. It's called the Emergent Women Community, I think. I don't even know what I named it, but anyways, you'll find it. Link is in the show notes. And the other thing is, if you're like, I'm just ready to go on this journey and this process, I am launching in the next 2 weeks a group version of what I do with this new framework. So this is simplified. I felt like my journey, my program had just gotten way too complicated because I just keep adding things to it. So we're simplifying, we're kind of reframing all of this, and we're going on this journey together. If you want more details, more information, I can say it's 12 months. It's not like a little commitment. You have a year to work through it. It's group, plus you get some one time with me, and we go through this process. And I can give you all the nuances. But if this is something that speaks to you and you feel like you're in a place where you are ready to do this and you want some help in doing that, you can jump in. Um, Send me an email. My email's in here. It's dralex@emergentwomencoaching.com. And I would be happy to just have that conversation and help you figure out if it's a fit for where you're at right now. Not selling anything. If it's a fit, awesome. This is my passion and my joy is to help women not only, heal, but also grow in themselves and who they are in the world and really step into who they be. So with that, I'm going to wrap this up for this week. I look forward to seeing you in the group. Please send me an email if this is speaking to you right now, and let's just have a conversation. And with that, I'll see you next week.